And here's our plan. We are going to spend 75 minutes-ish, and if we end early, we end early, talking about network analytics and what that helps us see about executive mandates. So when we're trying to make big workplace changes, which apparently everybody in the entire universe is trying to do all at the exact same time, what can we do to increase the odds that those might be more successful? And then also, what can we see if we have access to some of those patterns that lets us know that we're about to take us all down to a dark, dark place? Hey, everyone, nice to see you. We're going to start with a welcome and saying hi. Hey, guess what? We're doing that. That's why it's like pin drop. That's where we're at. Then Philip and I are going to just sort of set the stage. We're going to talk a little bit about why this conversation was an interesting one to have now and some of his existing research. I want you, as you are listening to that, to think about all of your questions, because we're only going to talk about 15 minutes. And then we are going to have you break into some groups with some of your colleagues here and decide which questions you want to have answered. And then in your group will come back and you will nominate somebody to take over the interview. You'll lead the interview for a while, and then at the end we'll say, okay, hey, what do we need to tell everybody else who wasn't here about what just happened? What's this bottom line up front that needs to come out from here? Okay, let's do a quick level set. Fist to 5, so 0 to 5. How familiar are you with organizational network analytics as a practice? So 0, I don't know anything about it. 3, I've kind of heard of it. And 5, I am all over this deep. This is my world. 1, 2, 3. Where are we? Some 3s, some 5s, a lot of 0s at 2s. Okay. Okay, so we've got some level setting to do. Because I think you were the only 5, Philip. So, yay, expert. And then show of hands, who has been on the receiving end of a workplace mandate in the last, yeah, return to office. Yeah, okay, I see. Thanks, Tracy, for the thumbs. And then who has been part of the decision to implement a workplace mandate? Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is something that hits a lot of us. What 3 words would you describe your reaction to big workplace mandates? Ooh, stress, 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 stress. Ballistic. Wow. Godzilla meets Bambi again is in the spirit of 3 words, but welcome everybody. And so with that, I think it's time to dive into hearing what Philip has to say. So I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you and me. And thank you, first of all, for being willing to come and talk to us about this. Can we start with what organizational network analytics are?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love to have these types of discussions. So, organizational network analytics is really a set of techniques to understand how collaboration occurs inside of organizations. It stems from network analysis in general, which is sort of an academic set of tools to understand how information flows in networks, and it's used in a variety of different spaces, from understanding security to biology. But when you apply it to organizations, what you're really trying to do is understand how information flows between departments, from managers to their teams, from leaders to the rest of the organization, between the organization and customers or partners externally. What does that flow of information look like? How much is there? Where is there a lack of flow of information? Where are the key pivotal points in driving more of that information flow or creating bottlenecks that might lead to disconnection or isolation? So really understanding those networks and the impact that they have on work in organizations.
How do you do that? Like, what do you mean understand how the communication flows?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways to do it. Broadly speaking, there are 2 major techniques that are popular today. One is passive analysis, which is all of the digital tools that we use every day to work, email, the calendar when we meet, Zoom, like we're using right now, they store data on all of the interactions across various different platforms in time, and that data can be mined and analyzed to understand the frequency and type and even quality of collaboration. And then there's something called active ONA, which is where you interview people and you ask them who are the top 10 best collaborators when you're looking for information about topic X or topic Y. And you run a series of interviews like that, and that sort of helps you create the knowledge graph or relationship graph of an organization manually through questioning. And often those two are used together. The passive ONA is great because it allows you to see how things are happening in reality, and active ONA is great because people can layer in context about what matters, the value of those relationships, who those key individuals or connectors are in the organization.
So how long does it, so if you're doing that, you've got like this passive detection of patterns, and then you've got active interviews. How long does a project like that take? Let's say you're starting from like nothing and you want to have a sense of how your organization flows. What would that look like?
Yeah, it sort of depends. So the benefit of passive analysis is the data's already there. It's sitting
Hmm.
across all of these tools. You're just ignoring it. You're not using it for anything, and you can quickly access that data and start to analyze it. And those projects are quick to get off the ground. Assuming that you have the correct privacy controls in place and security, etc. And they maybe last 2 to 3 months. But in many cases, they're continual. So people create metrics that they track across their organizations to understand, do we have silo departments? Do we have issues with the collaboration in different parts of the org? Passive analyses, those tend to be more point in time. You can't run surveys all the time, so you run one set of surveys. Those take a bit of time to plan, and then you analyze that, and you maybe wait another year or two before you run another analysis or research project of that type, and those are maybe 1 to 3 months in length as well.
So let's talk about something you mentioned in there. You talked about privacy, right? So you've got all this passive data stuff. And I know I've seen from the data, you're like, this is when people are in the office and this is when they aren't. And this is how often they're talking to their manager and whatnot. And that feels um, very big brother. What is the stance on privacy and how do we think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, top of mind when you're doing any of this type of work. What's really important is trust, that you have trust with employees, that they understand what's being done, so transparency, that you're clearly communicating why you're doing this type of analysis, and then importantly that there's something in it for them. So, the intent really matters. You're not monitoring what's going on in the organization. You're trying to understand workflow and employee experience, and the goal is to improve it, to provide more flexibility, to come up with better process, with better structure that creates a work environment that is more efficient, more pleasant to be in, and then there are also technology controls that you can put in place to automatically anonymize all of the data, so you're only looking at groups and functions and roles, not all the way down to the individual. And when that is clearly communicated, when there's something in it for everybody, and when people see results, when they're presented back to them, it's generally very well received and can have a major impact on employee experience in organizations.
Sounds to me a little bit like how a lot of the personality assessments kind of play out, right? Like that's pretty invasive, very personal data. And yet when everybody gets to compare their strength finders to everybody else's strength finders, they tend to enjoy that. So what is it? Can you show us what this looks like so that
Yeah,
we have a sense of it?
for sure. I have a few slides I can share,
I thought you might.
give you a quick sense. Let me go ahead and 1 second.
And then we get a sense of what these patterns look like. We can maybe better understand then what they tell us about return to the office and flattening of the organizations. Oh my goodness, it's snowing. We don't get snow like this very often.
This is good stuff.
1 second, the screen. I can't find the slides. There we go. Okay. Are those showing up?
Yeah, they sure do. There's some like chicken-handed people. Maybe
Perfect.
there's
Yes,
something
chicken
about them that
hand.
reminds me of chickens, but they're there.
So this is a little primer, mostly focused on passive analysis, which is using that existing data inside of those organizations, and really what that involves is connecting up to common data sources. So what are the digital tools that people use in order to get work done? Understanding information about physical presence as well. So whether people are in the office when they're collaborating or are they remote, and what that says about the type of collaboration it is. Is it face to face or is it hybrid? Sentiment data to understand how people feel about collaboration, and employee life cycle and segmentation data. So we combine all of that, and we analyze that, generate a series of metrics that describe what work looks like inside of an organization. At the sort of micro level, zoomed in, you're trying to understand what are the key pivotal points inside of the network, how many of those are, what leads to success in these different areas. So in this example, each of these is an individual on a team, and you can identify, a portion of the organization where the key influencers are, because they're in all the meetings, they're in all the conversations, they're in all the dialogue, and they're very pivotal. Or people who are information brokers. So Marta, I know you're in Germany, for example. Who are the key sets of individuals that maintain the connection between headquarters in the United States and a satellite office in Europe, and make sure that that information is flowing, that decisions flow, etc. So we're analyzing this type of data at the micro level. But in general, these analyses are done often at the macro level. We're looking across thousands of employees inside of large organizations to understand what these general trends are. And that's really where my expertise is. We've looked at data for millions of different employees across a wide range of different organizations, understanding what are the collaboration patterns that lead to better or worse outcomes, that lead to success, that create great work environments, and the like as well. And in practice, we're using a lot of data to try to understand those graphs. So that graph is obviously looks really exciting, but trying to interpret it on its own is like reading tea leaves. In reality, we're doing we're using statistics and a bunch of mathematical models to understand what collaboration really looks like between different portions of an organization. And this is a simple example of understanding how much do different offices collaborate across a large multinational, and which are the offices that are very isolated from the rest of the org. And in this case, Chicago office spends very little time working with any of the other offices in the United States, and maybe you want to implement interventions there. Today, I think we're going to talk about manager mandates, about delayering exercises and the impact that that has on networks. So we do a lot of trying to understand manager and leadership networks in organizations. And this is sort of a simple example where you see on the left-hand side a very hierarchical manager network where the manager has very little interaction with each of the members of their team, versus a flatter structure where the manager is involved in everything that happens inside of their team. So this is the sort of general space, understanding these networks in order to answer questions and make policy decisions, structural decisions, recommendations for how to improve experience in organizations.
Cool. So I can see how, in a lot of ways, what this is showing you is just what is. And it's not telling you how to interpret it. Like, it's possible in that previous slide that the Chicago office that is completely isolated is totally rocking it, right? In which case that tells you a completely different set of interventions than they're isolated and underperforming.
That's right. It is just showing you what is, and I think an important component is understanding how what is impacts those results, and that's where I mentioned looking at survey data, for example, to understand is the Chicago office feeling isolated? Are they struggling to get access to information, struggling to connect? And is how people feel about work matching up to what these information flows actually look like? And then moving beyond surveys into other outcomes. So, is other outcomes around efficiency, success, productivity, et cetera, that are also tied to these patterns.
So talking about how these patterns relate to what works and what doesn't, there were two pieces where this came to play, and we've talked with Michael in the past a little bit about remote work, but I want to talk about that was before the big return to office mandate started happening. What are you seeing in the patterns there that either suggests different ways that we should be looking at those return to office mandates, or that maybe they're a fabulous idea and everybody should move faster, or what do you know?
Yeah, definitely has been a fascinating time for this space. We've seen so much change, and we've been around for 10 years, so we sort of tracked what work patterns look like pre-pandemic and then into the pandemic and the various different stages, and how that impacted work in a very direct way. And in general, what we see is these major changes do have a significant impact on how people get work done and how they collaborate. As I think a lot of people feel, that obviously bears out in the data itself. But in general, what we tend to see is when organizations or teams or even individuals are remote for long periods of time, they still collaborate. We have great tools in place now, things like Zoom and Teams. You can still get a lot done when you're remote, but their networks tend to narrow. So they do a lot more work with a narrower set of people. And those are the people that they directly work with, that they're required to work with in order to maintain their day-to-day process and output and the things that they're trying to get done. What ends up happening though is that the people outside of that direct flow in other departments, in other functions, they're talking to them less over time. And that's because of the loss of the sort of serendipitous interaction that you get when you're walking around the office and you bump into somebody outside of your department. It strikes up a new idea, and then that spills over into digital collaboration over time. And we hear a lot from CEOs around concerns about that. So is that affecting innovation? Is that affecting our sense of cohesion as an organization? And certainly when you bring people back to the office, when you have an RTO mandate, you see those broader networks recover. So people start to have more of that serendipitous interaction, and they start to rebuild those networks as well. But we also see downsides to returning to the office. So there's sort of a balance. Things like your time for individual focus work. So if you're a software developer or a designer or a creative writer, and you need long periods of time to think, to problem solve, to come up with ideas, the office environment can be it's designed more for collaboration, could be a lot more disruptive, and that bears out in the data as well. People have a lot less time for that focused individual deep work.
So does the data show there's a sweet spot? Is there like, do you really need to be in the office some amount of time, but maybe less than we think, or?
Yeah, this is really what the sort of original article that Michael Arena and I wrote about are what those sweet spots are. And what's complex is that it's quite dependent on what type of work you're doing, what your role is, and then the fact that innovation tends to happen in stages. So broadly speaking, there are three stages to innovation. There's initial discovery where you're trying to come up with new ideas. And in that stage, you want a lot of interaction, you want cross-pollination, you want to talk to people from various departments. And being in the office can be better for that because it's easier to get hold of those people and to get all of those ideas brought in. And then the sort of second typical stage is you've come up with a set of ideas, you need to develop them. You need to get heads down, do deep thinking, write about it, come up with a strategy, a vision. And in many cases, being remote is a better place to do that. You're less disrupted. You can have more kind of structural interactions with people where you check in once a week or twice a week, but you have more time to do that thinking. Once you've implemented something, you're then trying to scale it up. You're trying to disseminate the ideas. You're trying to get it adopted in the organization. You're trying to roll the product out. And then broader connection inside of the organization is helpful, working with lots of stakeholders across the org. So it's really dependent on where you are in these stages. And what the data has shown is key is being intentional about when you're in the office and when you're remote, and trying to match it up to what the various requirements are in these different phases and types of work that people go through.
What an interesting challenge, because not every team is going to be in the same phase at the same time. And, you know, trying to get all that mapped so that you can do the right kind of intervention is going to be a real interesting puzzle. Well, I want to leave space for other people to ask all kinds of questions about that. I want to tap into one other aspect of all of this workplace change, which is relationships, right? So one of the reasons people bring people back into the office is because they think it creates stronger culture, stronger relationships between employees. And at the same time, we're seeing these mandates to flatten the management trees. What is that doing to relationships and how work gets managed?
Yeah. Yeah, we saw the start of this trend, focus in delayering a couple of years back. Meta was sort of very public about doing it, removing a broad set of middle managers in order to speed up decision making. That was sort of their rationale. Too many layers of management meant too many hops were required to make each decision. Everything was moving slower as a result of that. But that's a topic we've studied quite closely. We've looked at what collaboration and work patterns look like when you vary span the number of reports up into a manager. So, what happens when there are only 2 people reporting to a manager, and what does it look like when there are 15 people working with a manager? And what we found is that there does tend to be a sweet spot somewhere in the middle, and it's quite easy to go above that sweet spot and create an environment where the manager struggles to cope. And when they struggle to cope, they have less time for each of the individuals on their team. So we see, for example, one-on-one time between a manager and their reports collapses once you go over about 7 or 8 people on your team. Time spent in the direct workflow with your team, giving feedback on the work, that collapses when you get over a certain size. Manager workday length explodes when you get over a certain size because they just can't cope with the amount of work. They're in meetings all the time. Their focus time collapses. They have less time to get things done. And so their relationships degrade, their ability to think strategically, come up with a vision for the team, to get them motivated around what they're doing. All of those tend to degrade if you increase the team size too much, and it sort of defeats the overall goal of the initiative of those delayering exercises. Now, there is also, and I think we've seen clear examples where teams are too small, and you tend to see micromanagement or over-involvement in work where the manager's in every single meeting and in every single interaction, and there's less autonomy. And in general, the sweet spot varies from team to team, from company to company. It depends how senior, how experienced people are, etc. But we've seen, in general, a rule of thumb is something like from 4 to 7 reports on a team. And once you start to go over or under that, you run into issues pretty quickly.
Well, I know there are probably people on this call that are familiar with flatter styles of management and flatter, managerless organizations and whatnot. But you also know that those organizations have heavily designed practices on how decisions are made and all of that that distribute that autonomy through practice rather than through management layers. So you can't can't just remove managers and get that kind of performance without the design. It sounds like that bears out in practice.
Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating. There's so many things to dig into farther. I think we've done a good job with a level set. Let's get the group to decide what questions should be asked next. All right. So I'm going to let the rest of the group come back before we do the next thing. Your mic is misbehaving. Oh, what a bummer. I like your signage though. I bet you are not the spokesperson for your group. Well, speaking of group one, who is your spokesperson?
Who is group one?
Group one is Dirk, Scott, and Judy.
Dirk talked first. Judy's mic wasn't working, so we were in doing.
Not Judy.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay, I got it. It took a second. Dirk, we vote for Dirk then.
Dirk, is that cool with you?
I was just saying, it's got to be Scott, but I'll go.
Hi,
okay, great. So Dirk, I'm going to spotlight you and Philip, and then you've got 6 minutes to lead the conversation. Is that cool?
Yeah.
On your mark, get set, go.
Great. So, Phil, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I was curious around measuring engineering and specifically development productivity. There's the old school notion around linking number of commits, number of lines of codes to quality. Like, do you guys get into measuring what a high productive, high performing engineering teams do and proving that it's not commits? It's obviously you need to do commits and results count, but like, how do you measure that? And do you actually get into those studies?
Yeah, so the notoriously complicated topic, trying to measure productivity in knowledge work, not just engineering, but in any area of knowledge work. I think activity, which is what you were talking about, volume of activity, is a poor proxy for productivity, except at the extreme outliers. So if somebody's doing absolutely nothing, there obviously may be an issue there. If someone's doing insane amounts of things, there may be a burnout risk there, or potentially says something about productive. But anywhere in the middle of the distribution, comparing 10% more activity is not a good proxy for productivity in any way. And the main reason is that it lacks any context on the type of work being done and the quality of the output of that work. And so you need to have measures of the quality and the output. What we've looked at before is pulling in proxies for quality of work, which in many cases self-reported. So do we as a team feel like we're getting stuff done? Are we hitting our milestones? Are we achieving our projects? Are there financial results from what we're doing? Bringing in those sorts of aspects to better understand productivity can help provide a more complete picture. I do think that AI will introduce some interesting opportunities in this sort of space, potentially allowing in code, for example, an AI to actually interpret the code that's been written and glean something about the quality, the lack of bugs or faults, or the efficiency or performance of that code. That's going to be a very active space of research over the next few years, I believe, and perhaps it'll provide some sort of solution or better proxy for what quality looks like. So we're sort of watching that space closely. But today, I think you're sort of relegated to asking people and looking kind of high level proxies for productivity to understand it.
So a quick question for me, Philip, do your tools offer construct validity related to performance? Can you evaluate performance based on any kind of metrics that we see?
Uh, we tend to not directly evaluate performance. So we're looking at work patterns within teams, we're looking at dynamics, at day-to-day interactions, and we're tying them to a performance outcome. So that might be self-reported performance. So, for example, the teams that are reported as being the most productive, this is how they tend to collaborate. This is how the manager tends to get involved in work. These are the typical work patterns and processes for decisions, etc. And that allows you to copy the areas that are working well into the parts of the organization where they're reporting worse productivity or where there are worse outcomes, rather than trying to come up with a magic number for productivity.
Dirk, you
I
have 2 more
apologize.
minutes. Do you have any other question you want to ask?
Yeah, I think my
Or on
follow-up.
behalf of Judy?
Yeah, I think Judy, Scott, you want to ask one of your questions you had?
No,
in the
Judy asked,
chat.
in what
chat.
scenarios do hierarchical and flat structures work? And do you think it's more effective organizations having flatter structures?
Yeah,
So
it depends on a lot of things. The type of the work that's happening, the experience of the team, whether it's an environment where there's greater trust between managers and individuals in order to get things done. In low trust organizations, more hierarchical top down tends to be the pattern that you see and is required and maybe required in some cases in organizations where there is more trust, where team members are experienced, there's a belief that providing autonomy will lead to better results, then flatter works better. The type of work matters as well. If you're doing very new experimental work, then having greater contribution for a broader group. If you're doing very repetitive work, where there's less leeway for change in interaction, more hierarchical can be better and lead to better results. So it depends on a lot of factors, and you really want to layer in that direct context.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, group 1.
I have to apologize. Can I get my charger? Give me 30 seconds. I'll just
That'll be
plug in.
perfect. You go get your charger and we'll flip groups. Stephanie and Marta, who is your spokesperson? Thank you, Dirk.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to drop. I'll use this opportunity. I've got another call, but thank you so much. This is cool.
Cool.
Enjoy.
Thank you for
Thank
joining.
you. Yes.
Stephanie and Marta, who's your spokesperson?
I am Elise. Hi.
All right. Hello, hello.
Hello,
So I will not start your time until you actually have somebody to interview.
That sounds great.
I know it's imminent. What a cute little baby Monstera plant he has there.
You know
It will grow. It will grow.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Oh, no worries. Hi, Philip.
Hi there. Great to meet you.
Good to meet you. So Marta and I were talking more about sort of the complexities of the different sort of the different setups of the return to office world. So the one that I was talking about was one that I was part of. So you have an organization after the pandemic. They have promised and changed, and they are going fully remote because they want to, and they're a globally distributed organization anyway, so you have been working in this way, but their hiring practices now have gone to fully remote so that they can find the talent. So for instance, I was hired, I'm in Portland, Maine, but my headquarters is in Palo Alto, California. So when they called part of the organization to come back, it was, hey, some of you that are, within drivable commuting distance must come back. And if you're not, well, you're going to stay remote. I'm curious, and we were curious about more of like what you were seeing on the impact with the kinds of like metrics you're looking at, because the experience that we had was that it's really hard to do that. It's not impossible because we were all working distributed, but it was disrupting patterns of work. So those who were going into the office, their mandate was to be social. You're here to make connections and collaborate. But we had meetings and such and work times and focus times scheduled. And now you're asking me to change up when we do that. So now you're pushing me to say the times that I was usually in focus. We're not collaborating in the same ways. They're building ties. And so wondering what that kind of looks like for you and sort of what you've been seeing, and and are you seeing differences in how weak ties and strong ties develop, and do they disintegrate because of that kind of mandate? We're not all doing it together.
That sort of interaction. Yeah. That's a great intuition, and something we see a lot is the impact of more distributed work on return to office mandates. So when organizations went remote, yeah, it opened up a huge opportunity to hire outside of your headquarters in different parts of the world. So many organizations took advantage of that. They hired more broadly, as well as people moved away from their headquarters for lower rent or whatever the reason it might have been, to kind of escape from the big cities that were more stressful during the pandemic, I think, for many. And many people have not moved back, and so there still is this great level of distribution. And we looked very closely at the impact that that distribution has on the success of return to office mandates and various different strategies to bring people back. So, for example, one of the things that we commonly see is very low density in offices, peer density. So we look at through that network graph, who are the people that you most work with. So your top 10 closest collaborators. And what we found is in many cases, people come into the office and only 10 to 20% of their closest collaborators are there on the same day that they're there. So what ends up happening is they're on Zoom all day. They're not really focused on collaborating with people within the office. They're Zooming with people on the other side of the country or the other side of the world. And when you ask those people on aggregate whether they value in office time, they tend to report low value in coming into the office. There's no return on my commute time. I'm there, but nobody I work with is there. Maybe my manager is not there. Maybe my direct report's not there. So what's very important in the research that we've done is the quality of time in the office when you're there. Like, are you seeing those people that matter to you, that matter to your workflow more broadly when you come into the office, or are you just using it as a different space to work essentially remotely or in a hybrid way, which is what we see more and more of across many organizations. And you may have that density in your headquarters, but people often lack that density in all of their satellite offices. Everybody's coming into the New York office and they're spending all their time working with people in the San Francisco headquarters, for example. And so they're not getting the benefit of that in-office time. They're not building those stronger connections, those bridging ties, because it's just not the people that they work with who are there.
Right.
So does that answer your question? I think that was sort of the first
No,
part.
it does. I think it's really nuanced and complex. But a lot of what you hear in the news and in the headlines are these sweeping mandates, right? But it doesn't always take into account sort of a lot of companies that were already working distributed, or like you said, went out and changed their hiring patterns in order to meet talent needs, and changed their philosophy until they didn't any longer.
Yeah.
I think Marta was wondering too, more about like what's the evidence, or what's the best evidence for leadership to be giving for people to come in, because a lot of what you hear, right, is, well, they told you were doing great, you're productive, our revenue's up and our productivity's up and everyone's happy, but we still want you in. And they don't actually have reasoning behind it. Like, what are you seeing? Like, what are the most successful organizations in the sort of return to office giving as evidence to their employees?
Yeah. So it's undeniable that coming into the office leads people to building more connections. So we see that time and time again. And like I said, particularly those connections outside of your direct workflow. So in other departments, so let's say that you're in sales, those connections with finance and legal, et cetera. And we've tied that to greater ability to get things done. So if you're in sales, better performance in sales because you're able to push things through finance and legal in order to get the approvals you need to close a deal, the concessions you need to close a deal. So there's definitely evidence that you build broader networks, and there's definitely evidence that having broader networks in a variety of different roles leads to greater efficiency and success. So I think that would be one of the kind of strongest arguments for it. The other thing that we see is things like the quality of manager or leader relationships and tie into the vision in the company. So we've looked at the decay in manager relationships over time, for example. And what we found is if you don't see your manager face to face for longer than 6 months, people's affinity or self-reported affinity for their manager tends to drop. You're less likely to say that you like your manager, that you feel supported by your manager if you've spent half a year without meeting them face to face. And you're also less likely to understand aspects of company vision and buy into the overall sort of leadership messaging if you haven't seen leaders in a similar time period as well. So there is a sort of decay of that relationship and the sort of general culture of the organization that happens over time.
Yeah.
Fortunately, what we found though is that it doesn't take a lot of interactions to mitigate that effect. Coming in once a month, we found is enough, for instance, to rebuild those broader networks, to recreate those connections with your manager and with other leaders. But it's very dependent on the quality of what that in-office time is like. If you
Yeah.
come in and nobody's there, your leader's not there, your manager's not there, then you're sort of
Right.
defeating the purpose.
Now you're just mad.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, you got it. That's good. Oh, that's fascinating. I love digging into some of these, like it's once a month, right? Once a month done well. Such a huge deal. Ozra, thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Ozra, Erwin, and Kristen, who is your spokesperson?
I am, I think. And
Ah.
so I'm going to boil our questions down to two that I think will be meaty enough to fill up because we're running out of time. First question is when you collect organizational level data, like an employee survey or other things, how do you turn that into action inside of the organization and produce meaningful results?
Yeah, great question, tough question. I mean, we get that all the time, and proving that we're able to do that is key to what we do. So I think there are a number of aspects that are important in trying to do that. One is the research you're doing or the set of questions you're doing a priority within the organization? Is it something that people really care about? There's no point delivering an insight on something that isn't a top hot button issue inside of the org. Is there a willingness to change within leadership? So is it an important enough issue that they're going to take action, that they're going to change policies, that they're going to do something about it? So it starts with focusing on a problem that people take seriously, that is important inside of the organization before any of the research happens, before any of the work. If you try to do any of this work on things that aren't important, it's just not going to go anywhere. You might come up with very interesting insights, but no one's going to do anything about them. And then once you have that buy-in, once you see that that people want change, that they're willing to take action, depending on what the results are of that type of an analysis, then involving people and taking them along in the journey through that analysis, giving them reasons to care. So benchmarking, comparing against other organizations, comparing against best practices, giving people a sense of why they should care about a particular set of insights and why they should take action, pinpointing where the greatest points of leverage are in an organization. So if you are going to do something about this issue, let's say we're in too many meetings in the organization. We need to cut down on meetings. Where's the greatest point of leverage for attacking that issue? And one of the mistakes we see people make is they try to just create a broad mandate, stop meeting. You need to cut down on meeting by 20%. Reality is that 20% of people create 80% of the meetings in an organization. It's the managers, it's a couple of project leaders, those leaders, and that's your greatest point of leverage. So you have to identify your greatest point of leverage. You have to be willing to take action, and then you have to come up with concrete actions that those greatest points of leverage can take. And then lastly, you need to monitor the impact of those changes. So it's unlikely that the first action that you take, the first recommendation, the first policy change is going to lead to that decrease in time in meetings. You have to make metrics around time in meetings visible across the organization. You need to try something. If it doesn't work, have the willingness and the ability to try again, try again until you get it right. And often it's an iterative process of continuous improvement. And that requires having a North Star and continually working towards that. So it's difficult to drive real change. And there's a lot I can say about that topic, but that's sort of my general thoughts on what we see work well in organizations.
So assuming you've done most of the things you just described, how do you deal with the problem that as information flows about the topic you're interested in flows through the organization, people don't interpret it the way you intended it to be interpreted when you were discussing it at the top level? So how do you deal with misunderstanding and misinterpretations and just ignoring information when you deploy
Yeah, I mean
something?
that's sort of the general challenge with change management. It's not easy to drive change, particularly in large organizations. Messages get diluted. You need to have a simple message that makes sense. You have to give people a reason to care about that message, and you have to enable those greatest points of leverage. So you have to enable managers or key connected individuals in the organization with the information and help them disseminate it less top down and more organically throughout the organization so that people who distribute that information, they understand it and they're able to pass on that understanding at the team level as opposed to, doing one all hands at the leadership level and hoping that's going to kind of flow across the organization. So there's a lot to making sure that those changes disseminate correctly and people understand that information correctly. But that's sort of an ongoing challenge. And I think lastly, repetition is important. So if it is an important issue, you're trying to solve it. It's not going to get solved in one shot. You need to repeat the message over and over and track to a North Star, show results, give people a reason to continue to care, and that and show them how their actions are leading to better results.
Okay, I think that's our 6 minutes, isn't it?
It is excellent. So let's wrap up today for everybody. I'm going to click this button here. Very cool. Thank you so much. There's so many more things we could dig into in even more details, but as somebody who's been involved in many transformation projects, the whole idea that we could have a way to identify the people within the organization who are best suited to carry that change, both from the radical redundancy of the message and the ones in the center of where the activity is that we want to change. And that we could then have some data to tell us whether our change actually is helping or would be so amazing, so amazing. That's kind of what I'm taking away from this, that and some very specific insights. I'm curious for each of you. What is a key thing you've heard here today that you feel should be shared out with the folks in your world? And that we should make sure we highlight in the recording? Stephanie.
I think sort of where you were talking, Philip, about the strong evidence you have in terms of, I guess, how the relationships are being built, like that it is important to come in. And I think how long that those interactions, those purposeful and intentional interactions, can sort of carry you, and when does it decay? I know a lot of what you were saying actually aligns with work that Atlassian has done in terms of, doing purposeful and intentional gatherings even, right? So the larger events, because maybe you don't see each other as frequently, and that similar to what you were saying, they can get 3 to 4 months of a sustained relationship building mode and before it decays. So like you maybe don't need to do it as much as you think, but it really, I think a lot of what I was hearing, it really depends too on the team and the type of work you're doing. But it is important. It's not that it isn't, and that it's not, it does make sense to gather intentionally.
Very cool.
I
For all
would
my friends who
jump
are
in.
facilitators, there should be a lot of jobs for you helping companies do this like once a month. Erwin.
Sure, I would jump in and kind of build on what Phil said, that the having the data aren't enough. You have to have a process, a change management or related kind of process to deploy it into the organizations and into ways where, as Phil pointed out, you get the greatest points of leverage to have an impact.
Does anybody else have something they'd like to throw into the space? Also talks about the focus on organic and hierarchical dissemination of information in the chat. All right. Philip, thank you so much for being willing to just be in such an insights exchange structured conversation. You never know who's going to ask what they're going to ask. So it's a risk and an opportunity, and I'm one that I'm so grateful that you were willing to take with us. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and contributing. We will post the recording, including our bottom lines up front, at some point in the nearish future. If you want to learn more about Philip's company and their work, you can find him on LinkedIn. Amazing articles coming out of that in the PEX network and in other places, and their company, again, is Worklytics. And if you want to find me, you can find me on LinkedIn too. So I look forward to seeing you all again at a future time. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And officially done.